First, thank you all for coming out in this weather. I was expecting at least 5 people here, but I they are going to try to limit this to 45 minutes of me speaking and then a 15-minute question and answer session. So we'll see how it goes. I have an awful lot to cover. I may squeak over a little bit, but I think you'll enjoy it all. All right. First of all, it's, as you see here, chronology of the ship and other events coming up afterwards. This was the first time in peacetime that the Presidential Unit Citation was given out by President Eisenhower. And they put the letter N on it for our North Pole trip. I start out with explaining the nuclear age started with this. You'll remember some of that, I think, from, well, whatever your background is. The two nuclear bombs that destroyed 250,000 people. The first ship I was on was a troop transport in the Korean War, and we ended up going into Nagasaki in 1954. And it didn't look much different then than it did in this picture. There's a little estimate of some of the details of the bombs. There's the missiles that we're shooting today. They have, well, let's see, next slide. Oops, nope. Each one of these are a warhead and one missile, and they hold various ones, but this particular one has 5 of these warheads in it. Each one of those has 4 nuclear weapons in it. When they fire that, they already have pre-selected 4 cities to wipe out, or bigger states even, whatever. But just incredible what we are right now preventing by having this mutual deal about nobody's going to shoot them, hopefully. Here's a Trident aborted firing, which I was not happy, or not, I was glad not to be on the submarine that it was headed back for. So. And this happened out of something like 117 practice shots. This only happened on 10 of them. But okay, and this now is shifting over to development of nuclear power itself, and quote, the military industrial complex that we have today. This was the beginning of the program. Admiral Rickover, I think you've all heard of that name, was involved with actually deciding that that's what was the perfect submarine power plant. And that all submarines prior to that needed oxygen periodically, needed batteries to charge up, so they always had to go along the surface, charge their batteries, and then drop down for 18 or 20 hours or 30 hours at the most, once we got this thing started, it was basically as long as the food lasted. So. Harry Truman did put his initials in there, and about the submarine that now you may know is down in Groton, Connecticut, as a historical ship. One of the guys on there a few years ago ended up going down into the tank where this was, and sure enough, he took a picture of it. His initials are there yet. Here's the training we went through. When I got my orders, I was in Vietnam, actually, when I got my orders to submarine school. And when I got to Groton, and then put in for nuclear power school, I ended up out in the desert in Idaho for 50 miles out from Idaho Falls. And that's where this plant was. It was a complete engine room and reactor compartment of the submarine S1W, they call, you can see there, Submarine 1 Westinghouse. And that was a little bit of a shock because I was out there from January to June, and running sometimes in the morning and taking a bus out there 30 below zero was not the best deal. Then after 6 months, they asked for some volunteers to go to this site, which I don't think many of you knew about, but it was in West Milton, New York. It's still there. It's a training area now for not only submarines, but also aircraft carrier plants. And it had been for the other nuclear cruisers and whatnot that are all out of commission now. But, whoops, have you got, I don't know where that came from. Anyway, that ball there that you see, that was where the reactor and the power plant was for the sodium-potassium cooled plant. The first one, the S1W, the Westinghouse plant, was a pressurized hot water steam system. This one uses liquid sodium, and it was able to give you superheated steam and much better overall. The only trouble was after a few months, the liquid sodium ate the stainless steel piping, and you had sodium. The plant had to stay above about 300 degrees to keep it liquid, which meant as soon as it started leaking, now you got a bunch of radioactive solid stuff wandering around a reactor compartment. So that was taken off of, this plant ended up going to the second nuclear boat, the Seawolf 575. And they tore it out of Seawolf and here and put in an S1W plant, or with a General Electric design. This was showing you just one of the control systems that we all qualified on. There's your steam section, and your electric section, and your reactor section. And that's how you operated. I was an electrician, so I operated this plant. The reactor plant, and we had, thousands of guests that went through in the years that I was on there. And I got a kick of one of our chiefs on there, that the guy came through and said, "Boy, it must really be difficult learning all that stuff." And this was a chief from Massachusetts, by the way. He says, nah, hell. He says, you put banana oil in them switches, banana oil, and you could teach a monkey how to operate it. Those are some of the figures for the original Nautilus. And there's a few of your original dates. That's 54. And this is the layout of the ship. There's your torpedo room. This was different in that it was the first submarine that only had a forward torpedo room, no after room. This was devoted to some engineering, other plants. And then you had your galley, your battery underneath. You still needed a battery for emergency purposes if your reactor shut down and you couldn't get your diesel started or you didn't snorkel. Why, you'd run on your battery for about 15 minutes and then trying to restart the reactor. Control room, and then this is how the whole system worked. There's your reactor itself, and they created the heat, boil the water in the steam goes over, and through condensers, or through a steam generator rather, up into a secondary water plant. This is radioactive water. This is pure water over here. And then that goes out to your turbines. And you diesel, I see we have a couple of diesel boat sailors here, can appreciate that difference. Where the diesel boat would have surfaced several times on the way down to charge batteries and whatnot. This was the day they got underway for the first time. There's Admiral Rickover. This is the captain at that time, Wilkinson. He was the first captain selected by Rickover. And this is the first officer of the deck. And then this is the chief quartermaster, all up in the cockpit here. I've got a little story I'll tell later on about the cockpit, and we can go back to that. But an item I was involved with out in England or Scotland. Okay, just a couple of days ago, and a few years ago, that was the first time underway on nuclear power. The significance of that statement was that there was all sorts of public affairs people in the Navy that recommended to Captain Wilkinson what this wonderful statement should be about nuclear power and da-da-da-da-da. It would have been, 3 minutes worth of it. And he said, to hell with that. We're underway on nuclear power. Here's what happens at a 30-degree down bubble. Any submarine people know what all of those goofy things are, but we could dive actually as fast as a Piper Cub airplane. Okay, you heard that part. Here's one for you. we caught a fisherman out of Groton, and the nets, as you're going along, naturally the fisherman's got his nets out, dragging for whatever, and we come along at 200 feet or, well, near his nets and catch them. And all of a sudden they're going 10 or 15 knots backwards while we're dragging them away. So they get paid for their netting. That was the first one. The next guy is out of this area. I don't know if any of you still remember him or whatever, but anyway, that happened in '66. Luckily, I was not aboard when this happened, either one of them, but and February 4th, '57, 2 years later, we meet the Jules Verne 20,000 Leagues. Excuse me, I got it. Okay. There you go. First refueling, 62,000 miles, and after 2 years of operation. I was aboard for this one. We completed that in 2 months. Nowadays, it takes between 18 months and 3 years to change out the reactors. It was. In the last 5 years, the improvements of reactors have just gone wild. They now last the life of the ship. 40 years, 30 to 40 years. No refueling. Unbelievable. Yeah. And physically, it's about the same size. Just an unbelievable chemistry and whatever engineering. Okay, '57, we went from Panama Canal and Pacific Fleet operations, and that's when Anderson relieved Wilkinson. Let's see, I may have a little side story on that. Yeah. What happened when we got out of Panama into the Pacific, they had the whole of the Pacific anti-submarine force looking for us. We took about, I don't think it was 3 to 5 days to go up to San Diego. And we've got, well, the whole, so I don't know how many ships were actually out there looking for us. In any event, they never heard us. We surfaced in San Diego and said, here we are. And a couple of days later, we went out with this carrier group. They came up there and said, okay, now you guys stay within this 100-mile square and we'll look for you again. And we got underneath them, actually behind the carrier, just like this. I was lucky enough to be the phone talker for the captain, so I got to sit on the periscope a lot of times. And we had an under any height periscope. You could raise it 3 or 4 inches rather than the 50 feet and look through it and spin it around. And there was a nice chair you sat in. German design, we stole off the Germans after World War II. And so I was sitting there and it just unbelievable. The 4 screws of this carrier underneath, and we were probably 50 yards behind it. Beautiful water like this going along. And we had on torpedoes, they come in 2 varieties really. One is an exercise torpedo and the other is an expendable torpedo when you're practicing. The exercise you can fire when it makes its run under the ship, hopefully, and then out, and instead of a weapon, up in the bow, there's a big balloon, essentially, that blows up. It comes to the surface. Another boat picks it up and either brings it back to the ship or takes it back to a yard for recycling. The expendable torpedoes, after one of these has been used as an exercise fish a number of times, they finally say, oh, take it out and get rid of it. And those are the ones we really like, because you fire them and down they go. A quick little story before I probably get to it, but on a NATO exercise, when we come out from the under ice in '57 for the first time, in a NATO exercise, we were involved with, a simulated Russian bunch or whatever, and we had an expendable torpedo. It ended up that Admiral Wilkinson Captain Wilkinson at the time, he made all of his shots strictly by sonar. He never even bothered looking through the scope. And sonar reported that this was a heavy cruiser. He had the fire control party all line up. Fire control on that is talking about not a real fire, but firing the torpedoes. And the XO reported, okay, he had a good solution for this thing. And like I say, I was there with the captain. And the captain says, Boz, that's wrong. He did everything in his head. Yeah. And in any event, he went ahead. He said, that's that heavy that sonar reported. And he fired the expendable, set for depth below it, whatever. Well, about 4 days after this, we get a message from the State Department saying there was a Norwegian tanker that reported a torpedo went by underneath them. What the hell did you guys do? There's the view that I had, except naturally it was in the water, but there's your propellers, and that was fantastic to be looking through that thing and seeing these things going. The other little story about San Diego and finding this aircraft carrier, when we got underneath them or near them, we started fire. We had about 3 of the non-expendable torpedoes. We fired them at the cruisers and destroyers that were protecting the carrier. And then we shifted over after they fired the one expendable. We ended up firing flares. We simulated another torpedo. Next thing you know, we get there was an underwater communication system. They could talk to us. What they call a UQC. And they said, stop firing flares. They're landing on our flight deck. That was the end of that. There's one of what it looks like from underneath, but artist conception, I think. Okay, we returned to New London 88 days later. And my part was enjoying the breweries, because what happened is, in those days, there was no limit on visitors. If we didn't have the duty that we had to stay aboard for, we had to get off the ship until 6 o'clock at night and let the visitors go through all day long. And so we quickly ran out of money. And so we hit every brewery on the way up in Los Angeles, on the edge of the ice pack before we went under for the first time. And we got within 100 miles of the pole. And A bunch of stuff broke down. So we did, what we were doing, of course, was for the first time ever learning about what do you do up there under the ice. It ends up that these other times we spent there, and we had ice experts that had already given us all the information from. They've been doing this for years, you know, up there. And there's actually lakes that form up there. They call them the Russian name Polinyas, and they open to different various sizes. Well, what we had upward sounding fathometers on there, 4 of them. So as we're going along, you could look at the ice, and we also had the fathometer actually would measure the thickness of the ice. And then when you were lucky enough, you found one of these Polinyas, but then you say, okay, how big is it? Well, you make a couple of figure eights underneath it, sideways and lengthways, and get the measurements. And finally, if it's bigger, we finally found one that was big enough, captain wanted to, okay, we'll surface through there. So you come up very slowly, and it ends up, in the meantime, it looked clear, but there's a thing called Bergy bits, which is large ice cubes, you might say, that drift over that we didn't see. Big mistake, we had both periscopes up, come up underneath Bergy bit, bang, we went blind, broke off both periscopes. So that and these other things, the captain says, that's it, we're getting out of here. And with the loss of the 400 hertz MG sets, you also lost your compasses. Oh, now you're 180 miles from the pole, but almost everything is still directly south. No matter which way you go, you're heading south for a while until you finally get adjusted. In any event, luckily, we made it out and went on with our NATO exercise after that. There's your Bergy bit idea with coming up underneath it. And then we returned to the NATO exercise, and I told you about the Norwegian tanker thing already. Oh, now picture that cockpit picture. Okay, my other job as phone talker for the captain was when we were surfaced, I got to go up in the cockpit and repeat everything the captain said to the rest of the crew on a sound-powered phone system. Well, we had Lord Mountbatten of Burma aboard in Sandys, and Mountbatten of Burma was probably 6'5" or somewhere like that. And I ended up behind him in the cockpit up there, and it was rainy, and typically we were leaving Scotland, miserable. So I tried to jump up and sit on the back of the cockpit. Conveniently, I kicked Lord Mountbatten of Burma right in the ass. He just went, "Humph!" That was it. Okay. This was obviously when we went to the West Coast. What happened there? I don't know. Oh, that was okay. Yeah, that's when we left for the West Coast finally for this operation. They called it Operation Sunshine. Whoop. Okay, what happened when we got to Seattle, the ship went ahead and at that time tried to make the first run under the ice. And but there's a side story. I wasn't aboard. I had to leave the ship. I was assigned another duty to, a fella died on the ship. And I was assigned to take his body back to Chicago, because that's where I was from. So I left the ship when they did this, but that was the first time they penetrated up into that area, and it just got too hairy. They were almost trapped a couple of times by the low ice, and this kind of shows what you're stuck with. And you can imagine you're traveling 2 or 3 knots at the most, trying to ease through that, and then say, hey, how deep is this going to get? That's when the captain, after a while, just said, hey, that's it. And they wormed their way back, and they were assigned to go to Hawaii. And now this was in July or June, late June. And they said, hey, just stay in Hawaii. And they did some airplane flights over the Bering Sea to watch the ice recede back a little bit. So, and then luckily, then I did my job on bringing the guy back, and we buried him in Chicago, and then I reported into the skate. And while I was on the skate, and it was in the electric boat, getting ready, it ended up for an under ice trip. And there was the captain of the skate was named Lord Calvert. And Lord Calvert was determined to beat out Anderson for whatever he could do on that. And he thought he could be the first to the North Pole. Eisenhower told him, you stay outside until Nautilus is done with their trip. So he was a little frosted over that one. But in any event, why, that's, I'm in New London by then, and I get a call from the executive officer some Saturday morning. He says, Degnan, be in Groton Airport tomorrow at 8 o'clock. We're flying to Hawaii. I said, what are you doing in New London? He said, we'll tell you when you get on the ship. And that's when they had gone up, tried to get through. And of course, I didn't know any of that. So, and anyway, I got to go to Hawaii. And then on my briefing of the captain about the burial, I mentioned that Lord Calvert was getting ready to go up. And that's when he said, hey, we're going to leave a week early. And that's when Calvert was told to stay outside the ice and wait for us. Yeah. And you picture this, Hawaii's over here. And here you can see how the track goes, trying to find your way for under the ice and find a hole that we could go through. So that takes a day or two wandering around there, and then finally zip under the North Pole, and then down to Iceland. We stopped there, and a helicopter picks the captain up to take him back to Washington to report to Eisenhower. And my little side story there is, I was on watch, and we're surfaced out there waiting for the helicopter, well, getting ready for the helicopter. And the steward comes back and sees the engineer. He says, I was on an electrical panel. He says, get Degnan relieved. The captain needs a haircut. Well, ends up, he got word that I was cutting hair for 50 cents a head to make a little money. So, and I had never cut his hair naturally before. He comes back, and He said, I'm going to do a good job. I'm going to see President Eisenhower. So I'm like this, so, whatever. In any event, well, then we go to London and wait for him. There's the navigator's position report when we pass it under the North Pole. That's, like I say, everything from there is south. Okay. And then the big deal there was coming back from England. We get a ticker tape parade in New York City. So pretty wild. And it was 103 days from the time we left Hawaii. So. Now, did we have fun? That's me. These are the Follies Bergère girls of the London edition. So I will leave it at that. That's the entrance to New York City. And of course, all the tugboats were red, white, and blue water they were firing out. There's your ticker tape parade. And this happened, well, obviously, later on in 1966. But that's what happens when you surface under an aircraft carrier. Luckily, no one was injured. Nothing really major happened, except it was a disaster for repairing it. And this was really the amazing part. When you read all of these things about captains being fired one after the other today, and admirals and whatnot, Rickover stood by Captain Fogarty, who used to be my division officer, and said, hey, he left him in charge, and in fact, he ended up taking over the whole site out in Idaho for the training thing after that. And there's some of the final things. The most important thing, make your surfaces equal to your diets. Okay, I hope I'm doing all right for time. Here's what I call a extra special, and there's a lot of good stuff here, I think. Special operations. We doing all right?
Well, we only got about 3 or 4 more minutes.
All right, I'll speed through it.
Talk quickly. Talk New England, fast.
Here's the special operations that went on. This was you may have heard or read about this, Operation Ivy Bells. Yeah, I'll just let you read that over there and we'll go ahead and Petrovac is in the northern Pacific Ocean. It's a major submarine base for the Russian Pacific Fleet. Saturation divers are divers that can go down actually up to 1,000 feet, but they have a device that goes with them that they live in that in between dives for weeks on end. Unbelievable what they go through. Here's what they did. They connected this, well, the story about the first one that went in, hell, but they said, how are we going to, what this is something they put on the Russian cables that, well, broadcast throughout Russia for military secrets and whatever, all sorts of good information. They attach this to their cables, the divers do, and we listen to them. It ends up for months at a time. Those boats would sit there for 2 and 3 months doing nothing but sitting on this cable with this thing attached, listening and collecting all the information from them. And we talk about a boring time. I can't think of anything worse than just sitting on the bottom waiting for 3 months. These were the special boats. The Seawolf was modified, the original Seawolf, and then Halibut, Richard Russell, Parchie, and Jimmy Carter was configured with that rig. That they all took their turns. I think it lasted, I don't know, 5 or 6 years we were listening to them. Here's out in Idaho. I bring this up. The only fatal nuclear reactor accident we ever had. I'll let you read that over. It was an unbelievable, and the 3 people, they were 3 sailors, second-class electricians, that were responsible for, of all things, they were able to pull the control rods up by hand instead of using any electrical system or whatever. And the one guy just lost control and pulled one rod up too fast, and bang, created that, you know. And that was 1961. Then we had the Thresher disaster, which I think you're all familiar with over the years. I've read that. The commanding officer of Thresher was one of my division officers on Nautilus in the early days. Yeah. And then we lost the Scorpion, and to this day they don't know. There's all sorts of stories about what happened to Scorpion, but nothing really conclusive. But this is all they did find it. I think it was like 20,000 feet or something out off the Azores. They think it was probably a torpedo went off. Same thing as the Russians had with the Kursk. There's the San Francisco. They ran into a seamount. And that was, well, you can see, pretty recent, the most recent one. Luckily, we didn't lose the ship, but they ran into at almost 30 knots. They ran into a mountain underwater, uncharted. Well, it was on a chart, but they didn't have the chart with them that had it on there. The amazing part right now is that they took that bow off of there, replaced it with the bow of USS Memphis, which they put out of commission, and it is now in South Carolina at the Nuclear Power School in South Carolina, and my grandson is teaching. This is what happens when they put, nowadays, the ships out of commission. They're so damn radioactive that what they do, they take and they cut a reactor compartment right out of the ship with the steam generators, the whole works, and they put it on. This is done in Bremerton, Washington. They put it on a barge and they haul it up the Columbia River to Washington State. I'm trying to think of the name of it doesn't matter the name of the town, but it's northern Washington State. And what is here, of course, they're all numbered, and this tells you which boat they came from. Yeah. They have a half-life for their radiation of 210,000 years. So it'll be around for a while. There's the Kursk, and here's what happens when their torpedoes go off. There's where the missiles are fired from Kursk on that side, and this the other side. But and here's some of the fun days. I'll let you read that over. I don't think the crew appreciated them relieving the captain. You may have recently heard about them, guys. The cartels are now buying and building their own submarines and using them for drugs. And there's an anti-diver deal. I don't know of anybody that's actually used one, but the Russians have it. And we sneak in and go into get so far up river sometimes we're in fresh water. Might violate the 3-mile limit, or 12-mile limit. And here's one you may remember from your school days or something. You could buy a baking powder submarine. And that's it. All right, that was close.
Questions and answers from?
Pardon?
Question and answer time now?
Yeah, yeah. Anybody has any questions or?
What's that latest slide you showed us of those remote control?
What now?
That UVV, is that a remote control device that's underwater the Russians are using?
I'm still not getting it.
Okay. What she's asking is that a remote control type submarine that the Russians are using for divers?
Oh, that I have no idea. It was just a
Probably an
picture.
unmanned system.
Yeah. I would think it could be, yeah, with all the stuff they've got nowadays. But and I would guess that, every there's right now today, I belong to another outfit called the International Submarine Group. They have a meeting once every 2 years in a different country, and there's something like, I think it's over 100 countries have submarines nowadays. Some of them are unbelievable. There's a few of them that have, Pakistan or something. Pakistan's got like 2, but they're qualified. They have a nuclear bomb. So I can't remember whether they are able to use them for missiles or not. But there's 4 or 5 countries just have 1 or 2 submarines. And they buy, one of Bacon Powered one reminds me, they buy the Germans and the Norwegians and the Swedes have what they call AIP propulsion, air independent propulsion. These things run on various different fluids. Oh, can't think of what they are now even, but they're chemical reactions. And they are able to stay down for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. In fact, we rented the Swedish one for 3 years out in San Diego with the Swedish crew running this thing. They sank every one of our carriers out of San Diego. With the silence, they're as silent as nuclear ones. Nuclear ones, of course, can be fairly noisy. Nautilus was probably the worst one. When we left, the story goes, I wasn't aboard then, but when they left on the first trip to checking the ship out, they picked us up on what they call a SOSUS, S-O-S. It's a system of sonar that is spread throughout the whole Atlantic. They picked us, Nautilus, up on sonar when she left New London Harbor. That's how noisy it was with the turbines and whatever. Nowadays, we're almost as quiet as a diesel boat used to be, or is now, whatever. You still cannot beat diesel and these new AIP ones for lack of noise underwater. Anyway, that anything else or?
Yeah, the British sub that was waiting to go under the ice under the North Pole with Nautilus. Eisenhower told them to wait.
Yeah, it wasn't British. It was one of ours.
Oh, it was one of ours.
Yeah, it was the Skate.
And now it was. Would it have been capable of going under and doing that first?
Oh, it did. It 3 days later, it went up there. It was the first one to surface at the pole. Nautilus, we just went zooming right under it and didn't stop for anything. And so Calvert was very happy about that. Yeah, there was all sorts of pictures of that. They ended up surfaced at the pole. They had Santa Claus and they had a North Pole thing they stuck in. They played a game of baseball, and they could run around the world by going around the bases. They had a great time, and since then there's submarines up there all the time, and in particular the British are going with us, a lot of them, and we surface together. There's pictures of 2 U.S. submarines and the British submarine up there, broken through the ice. And some of those, the construction of these new ones now, or the sail, they are breaking through now up to 5 and 6 feet of ice. Now that takes them, I don't know how in the hell that, just thinking of blowing your tanks, obviously that's what you have to do, blow the tanks out of water to get the enough surface to push the ice out of the way. Where, like, we hit that little bergy bit with our periscopes, thing, that was it. By the way, on a little side one on that periscope deal, we had 2 of our welders ended up, we surfaced up there, still, in a bergy bit, or bergy, Polinia, and we had 2 of our welders get up there and actually weld that periscope that broke, one of them. And the amazing part about it, of course, periscopes need a vacuum to operate. And the thought was, how are we going to get a vacuum? Well, typically one of the enginemen said, hey, we got a steam turbines back there that have a perfect vacuum for the condensers. 30 pounder or whatever it is, 30 vacuum. And then he went, that's what they did. They ran a hose from the main condenser all the way up to the periscope, pulled the suction on it, and bingo, fixed it. That was all before we got to Scotland to get some repairs from the tender, you know. But it was amazing what the crew could do when they had to, you know. And when they did it, it was like blowing 40, 50 knots and colder than hell and freezing, you know. So, yep.
Now, do you think that the ice has thinned a lot up at the pole? I mean, they talk about it being thinner than it used to be. Does that make traveling up there, et cetera, a lot easier than it used to be when you went? Thickness of the ice?
Oh, I would think that it always had been continually changing in depth and whatnot, you know.
Did they measure that when you went up? Did they have any kind of way of measuring or collecting information about how thick it was, et cetera?
Yeah, that's what we had, that what we call upward sounding fathometers.
And do you
A
know-
fathometer measures usually the depth of water. And but these were twisted around going up, and they would actually it came through on a screen, and it would give you the actual depth. We could tell whether it was an inch or two of ice or 2 or 3 feet, whatever. Yeah.
And what did you do with all of that information? They just collected it, or?
Oh yeah, it was collected, and then for many years, in fact, submarines going under ice, diesel boats went under ice back in the late 40s. But they would go in for, you know, a half a mile or something, and then get out again, because they just couldn't trust the amount of power they had in their batteries and the amount of air or whatever. But yeah, that's been going on for so long.
It's a great adventure.
There's actually a Navy bureau that's set up just for under ice operations. So all of those charts and information, debriefings and whatnot would go to that outfit, you know. Yeah.
Very interesting.
When you showed the first under ice crossing, the chart showed how initially there was some zigzagging. You said trying to find a hole,
Yeah.
and then it was straight through.
Yep.
But how can you find a hole like hundreds of miles long that's straight?
Yeah.
I think it was the ladies in London they were getting too quick.
Well, in those situations, we could use active sonar. You got two kinds of sonar on the ship, active and passive. Active is the trouble is with active, it gives your position away. You're sending out bang a signal and then getting its reflection back and say, okay, you measure that and say, okay, that guy's 1,000 yards away or half a mile away. Passive, you're just listening and for shrimp, torpedo noises, whales, whatever. But so we'd be using active sonar, which would always, in fact, on the first trip, one night about midnight, this was on the way up there before we got under ice, but I had just gotten off watch about midnight, and I was living up in the forward room at that time, forward torpedo room, and I had just gone through the control room, and all of a sudden we took a 30 or 40 degree up angle. And by the time I got to where I was trying to go, a fire extinguisher come flying down, almost whacked me up. It ends up, I ran back to control saying, what's going on? And sonar had picked up, quote, a target ahead of us. Well, it ended up, after we slowed and they played around a little bit more, they figured it was just a big whale. And luckily we hadn't run into it, or it didn't run into us. But I was almost the only casualty. The fire extinguisher flying by me.
Did you ever hit any whales on your voyages? Did you ever hit any?
Not that I didn't know of, no. And we'd have known a whale if we hit that, I'm sure. But other than that, we've never hit any of the, except fishermen.
So,
Yeah.
it's rumored you have the best chefs on ship, on the boats. Was the food good?
Well, yeah, actually, the first 2 or 3 chefs, and they were chefs, they sent to CIA, Culinary Institute of America.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, we had great food. And they served actually 3 regular meals a day. And then at midnight, you had, quote, soup down. And then if you were still hungry, every bench that you had in the mess hall, you could lift it up and pull out a can of tuna fish or baked beans or whatever. Trouble was finding a can opener. Other than that. But yeah, we ate very well. In fact, I lost about 60 pounds in the last 2 years. Finally.
How did the compass work under the ice?
Well, what happens with the compass, the only reason we were even able to make that trip, compasses, the 2 that existed were Arma and Sperry. And when they got up to about 86 degrees north, they went nuts. They didn't know what the hell. They just flopped. They start flopping. So you don't know where you're at. Luckily, guided missiles had a thing called, it ended up, they call it SINS, they made it Ship Inertial Navigation System. And actually, the first one we had for that trip, it was off of a Navajo missile that was designed to run like for 4 minutes. And we ran it for months, you know. But and we had a couple of civilian engineers rode with us. And the amazing part, the guy had an actual slide rule that looked like a coffee grinder. He'd punch his numbers in and wheel it. What that had to do with what he was getting out of this inertial navigation system, but it was supposedly checking. And they claimed when we came out, I think we were only really by thousands of yards from our exact position, whatever, yeah. And we'd have never made it. Well, like I say, the year before, we didn't have that when we went from the Atlantic, and we got up to 86 north, and we had 2 gyros, a main gyro and an auxiliary, and they just started flopping. And where am I? Where am I? So that's why the captain was pretty happy to turn around and get out of there, I think, because we didn't really know what would happen if we continued on further at that time. But this inertial navigation now is fantastic. And they're using the satellites and all of that. Now with the periscopes read the satellites. Unbelievable, all of this stuff. And communications nowadays, they stay underwater for, 23 and 6/10 hours or something, and then pop a scope up, and within 30 seconds, download weeks worth of information or whatever. Unbelievable what's going on nowadays with all of this stuff. I'm sorry to have left it, but I like to keep up with it, obviously. So I do want to see him. Bob mentioned in his write-up, my wife is here, and I have to say her background is better than mine. She was the chief florist. Ooh. You tell him.
What's the matter, Joe?
I can't. I just break up.
I worked for a few presidents.
Chief florist for the White House for 8 years. She's got better travel stories than I got. Okay, guys. Thank you. I think that's it.